Okay, welcome back, vintage gamers, to a live reaction video. I am recording this 11/13 on the day this airs. I have not seen the banned and restricted announcement yet. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to read through it, give you my reaction, go through what they've written, and see if we can glean any additional information. And then I'll do a quick go through of the data pre Fantasticar printing as a way to give some options on what you might want to start looking at for the new metagame. I say new metagame because I am expecting a restriction of Fantasticar at the minimum. If there is more than just the restriction of the Fantasticar or even unrestrictions, that would be extra, and I'd love to dive into that. But I'm expecting a Fantasticar restriction. If there is no changes in this announcement, I don't know what we're going to do. So here we go. Refreshing the page. Let's see what we got. Standard, 3 bans. Legacy, the Fantasticar is banned. Vintage, the Fantasticar is restricted. Okay, so we got our bare minimum. We got exactly what we thought we would get. And we're going to start to approach vintage in hopefully a similar way to what it was pre-Fantasticar. Let's see if there's any additional information here. Let's jump down to vintage. Vintage. The Fantasticar is restricted. No further information. Okay. They say tune in to tomorrow's weekly MTG to discuss this change and more. That's, oh wow, nothing for Legacy either. Were they just not prepared to write anything on Legacy and Vintage? That's extremely surprising because historically they've always included some amount of verbiage on why they did things. So the fact that they've included nothing here and have instead directed us to the weekly MTG show, which usually airs on Twitch, that's certainly a departure from the norm. Like I said, it could just be something like they didn't have time, or so you can see a lot of these things are written by and accredited to different members of R&D, and there is no written accreditation here for Vintage and Legacy. It's possible that the person, I think it's usually Eric, who writes these was maybe away or something like that. Either way, we'll have to tune in tomorrow to find out why this happened. I mean, we know why. Here's the data. This is why. Raker Shops has been crushing the metagame in Vintage since the card's printing. 20% of the metagame, 56% non-mirror win rate. I'm surprised maybe a little bit by the Legacy. I know the Legacy data does not look as bad as the Vintage data, though it is more widely applicable. The car is in more decks in Legacy than in Vintage, and Vintage is basically all coalesced inside of that Raker Shop shell. So yeah, let's talk about what did Vintage look like pre-car, and then how does one car change that. I want to do Tezzeret to car. I think that's the most reasonable data set. I think the printing of Stock Up was a huge deal, and the printing of Tezzeret was a huge deal. But the printing of Tezzeret comes with a year of data, so I like that. Whereas I think the 5 months leading up to Tezzeret, I would rather see the data with Tezzeret, because I do think the Raker Shops deck got a noticeable increase in power with the printing of Tezzeret. So here is what Vintage looked like before car was printed, starting from Tezzeret. So we're looking at 50,000 matches of Vintage, 181 challenges, and a bunch of other events. And pre-Fantasticar Vintage had all 3 shops decks performing well, with sizable meta shares of 6, 6.5, and 9.5. With Sphere Shops and Raker having solid 52-53% win rates, good strong decks, and Jewel also having a 52% win rate. So all 3 shops options were good prior to car, and all 3 shops options can choose to play one Fantasticar. It's a little unclear on like how good one Fantasticar is in Sphere Shops. I think it's totally fine in Jewel, and then I think it's obviously great in Raker. I would expect all 3 of these decks to be playing one Fantasticar until something shows that it's not working. Like some kind of pilot says, hey, this is not good, and stops including it, stops top biting with it. and then maybe you'll see it. But restricted cards do a weird thing in Vintage where even if they are not optimal, people will include them because they are restricted. For a very long time, we saw one Ponder in basically every blue deck. And once Ponder was unrestricted, now we see 0 Ponders. So, prior to Fantasticar printing, Dredge was doing very poorly, very, very poorly. I expect that to continue. With Raker Shops being kind of boosted in the spotlight now, post-car, I expect a sizable Raker Shops metagame share, and any of these Tezzeret, 4x Tezzeret decks are just going to be incredible against Dredge. I don't really expect that to be different. Prior to the cars printing, we had basically no Countervine, and then post-cars printing, people were playing a bunch of Countervine, but a lot of that is due to the fact that frog decks that used to consist of, upwards of 20%, 15 to 20% of the metagame, were very much pushed away in the car metagame. With Wastelands coming back, with Bowmasters coming back, I would expect Countervine to decrease in meta share again, from whatever it was. It was the third most played deck in the car metagame. Doomsday, always like a seldom played deck, but a reasonably strong deck. The deck always doesn't want to see like those frog controlling decks. And while the Doomsday deck will get access to one car, I don't think it really changes Doomsday's position in the format, where Doomsday is a fantastic deck against most of Vintage. It's just not a very good deck against the blue controlling tempo frog decks with Wasteland. Prior to the cars printing, Tinker decks were doing extremely poorly on MTGO. But something to recognize here is that Tinker is a broad and encompassing category with lots of different variations: Esper, Grixis, Wheels, whatever. And prior to the cars printing, there was a very strong Grixis Tinker deck focusing on Hexing Squelcher and Hold Breacher that my teammates and I took to NYSE and did very well with. That didn't exactly translate immediately into online, and maybe it doesn't have online staying power because it's very much a blue-focused, anti-blue deck. It just kind of struggles versus like heavy metagame shares of things like Initiative. So maybe that doesn't. But the thing to keep an eye on here is that deck will play one car, but we want to see what decks move to the forefront. If we move back towards a blue heavy metagame, then it makes a lot of sense to be looking at these Hexing Squelcher Tinker options. Initiative was actually, obviously one of the most played deck in this data set for the last year. But prior to car in like a smaller data set, Initiative was definitely trending way off. And with the car metagame, having Initiative be like a reasonable deck against Raker, you saw a very big spike in Initiative's play rate up to the second most played deck. I would expect it to not trend down for a little while, just because one, challenge players, there's always going to be some kind of meta share of Initiative because of a few factors. The deck is very cheap to build compared to other Vintage decks. The deck is very fast to play, so double queuers and other format grinders play it. It's also fairly straightforward in its strategy and how it approaches the game plan, the game. So multi-format grinders really trend towards this deck, even though this deck hasn't been putting up incredible numbers in over a year, really. It's been putting up basically a 49% win rate for about a year. It will always be a substantial metagame share on Magic Online, and I expect it to be a substantial metagame share in like Paper Eternal Weekend in North America as well. So I would expect that to hold for a while, which I can't remember exactly how much it was. If I just go Control-Z, the car metagame share of Initiative was 11%. I expect it to hold around 10% just for at least a little while. If it stops putting up top 8s, that's when you start seeing the shrinking metagame size, and then maybe it flows back down to like an 8%. But again, I don't think, even when Initiative was putting up really poor numbers, same with Dredge. Dredge and Initiative both can put up very, very poor numbers and still encompass 5%, 8% of a Vintage online metagame because they are multi-queuing decks and they are cheap decks. Oath, sizable metagame share pre-car. I expect that to continue because I do still really like the Oath deck against, I think it's totally fine against like a normal Raker Shops deck that focuses more on creatures. And obviously it's like nice against the Sphere Shops deck. You don't really want to see it against the Jewel Shops deck, but you do like Oath against Dredge. and initiative. It's okay against initiative, and then it's very good against blue-black Lurrus control that doesn't play Containment Priest. And that's like probably the biggest winner of Car is that Frog decks no longer have to drastically change their composition to beat Car decks. These decks were playing main deck Consigns, main deck Mindbreak Traps. We might see a regression towards previous Frog decks that play a little bit more a wide range of removal and counter magic. It'll be interesting to see what Lurrus PO does post this. Obviously, every single Lurrus deck cannot play Car. So it'll be interesting to see how Lurrus PO does going into this metagame. I think Lurrus PO was on a bit of a transitional period where people are trying to make the deck. The deck is already, very combo light. It's very much almost a Jeskai control deck, and you started to see that with things like Dan Nelson's top 8 and NYSE with some flow state, some null rods in the board. So it'll be very interesting to see where PO goes from here, if it continues to lean towards control or if it goes back to a little bit more combo-oriented gaming. Lurrus Breach, a deck that people have been talking a lot about because it was one of the few decks succeeding inside of the car-based metagame. Obviously, super strong win rate on Magic Online here with a very, not a very small metagame share, but a small metagame share. Piloted by some of the best players on the platform. You have to be a little bit careful with this kind of data here where you're starting to get this small. But clearly a great deck, clearly an above 50% win rate deck. This deck was falling off a bit on the tail end before Car was printed because of the rise of Hexing Squelcher decks inside of Tinker, inside of PO. It loses a lot of it's a lot of the advantage that Gift Drain Breach gains is by being the best blue deck at beating blue decks. And it's not really set up to be beating Hexing Squelcher because it wants to play on the stack. It doesn't want to play removal, and it can play these cards. Don't get me wrong. You end up with a more a wider metagame slot and less powerful deck, but like you'll see Discover and play a bunch of like Braids and different kind of removal spells in this kind of list. It's just that typically this deck, it's heavily focused on beating other blue decks. So if you're seeing these other blue decks come back into play, then it makes a lot of sense to continue looking at this Lurrus Breach deck. It'll be, this is one we're going to want to keep our eyes on as we move into the new metagame. If this continues to do extremely well inside of the new metagame, then you have to think that this deck, it should start growing in a metagame share. This already is a bit of a growth compared to, maybe even, I would assume like if you look at the first 6 months of this compared to the second 6 months of this, it is a growth already. We'll just have to see where it lands if it continues to be a major metagame player. It doesn't seem like a deck that people are willing to just like pick up and jam, whereas things like Lurrus, PO, and Frog do. So that's a consideration as well. So those are the things we're going to be looking at. If you are a Fantasticar player, you've been playing Raker Shops, I don't think it's a very hard transition for you. The last winning Raker Shops list here from Jake, I think all you really have to do conceivably is cut the Gataxian Probe because you're not trying to maximize for Fantasticar. You cut down 3 Fantasticars. You could even keep Defense Grid if you wanted to, and then you play, 4 Patchwork Automaton or 4 Scrawling Crawler. And you basically make your deck, give yourself a little bit of an aggro combo hybrid plan instead of being all in on the combo aspects of the deck. But for the most part, this deck list stays mostly exactly the same. And that is like something I talked about in my announcement as well, is that prior to the printing of Fantasticar, Raker Shops was doing extremely well. This is a 53% win rate over the year prior. If you narrow the data even more to more like this year, it actually goes even higher. So recently, Raker Shops prior to Car was doing very well. I would expect Raker Shops to take a bit of a dip as it still has a targets on its back. People are going to be slow to change their decks. Like we might still see some main deck Mindbreak Traps and Consigns for a while. It'll be interesting to see how long like the anti-Car measures stay in there. But this is a deck that doesn't really want to be the spotlight. It wants to be exploiting a hole in the metagame. All in my opinion, all of the kind of non-interactive linear decks like Raker or Initiative. Well, Initiative not exactly non-interactive, but decks that are more linear and are trying to execute a game plan. Typically, you can beat a singular game plan with sideboard hate and vintage. So that's why historically, in a more balanced vintage format, Dredge comes and goes as a strong deck because, as people take away Dredge hate, Dredge gets better. As Dredge gets better, people put in more Dredge hate, Dredge gets worse. And that still applies for something like Raker Shops or Initiative. As Initiative gets better, people play more Removal. As Raker Shops gets better, people play more Consigns and more Mindbreak Traps. And so hopefully with, less meta, this is a 9.5% meta share. That's way less than half of what Raker Shops is right now. I would expect some people to try Raker Shops out. I wouldn't be surprised if it continues to do fairly well in a post-car metagame, because it was already a good deck pre-car, and it's getting a car which is definitely an upgrade to the deck. It's just hard to see how much one car is an upgrade to a deck's success when you don't even have tutors for it, right? So like sometimes Raker will hit you with a different kind of oops I win that you won't really be prepared for, and that's kind of the problem with restrictions in general, is that they make games higher variance. They make more different ways that you can like not be prepared. One of the things that people say about Urza Saga a lot is the one Urza Saga can be more frustrating than the 4 Urza Saga, because when you had 4 Urza Saga, you could at least make your game plans around it. You play, dress downs, and you have ways to beat it. But then sometimes, you don't hold your wasteland because, well, they only have one saga, and if they have the one saga, then you get punished, right? So those kind of things happen when you have those the restricted one-ofs. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. I would not be surprised if we see Frog go back towards the top here. I really think that these decks, Frog decks, are exploitable. They have only a certain amount of spells, and if they're trying to beat a wide metagame, they actually get worse in general. And so you can look for holes in their removal suite, look for holes in their interaction, and that's how you usually attack them, or like go super over the top of them. Things like Luris Breach, Gift Drain. In the past, I've had success like even with non-Luris decks and like Beans and those kind of, not exactly Beans, but the style of Beans, or like Quantum Riddler, going over the top to beat them. And then, like I said, all of these decks are just like, besides Bazaar, prior to the printing of Car, you had a pretty large range of playable decks. Here we're looking at like 8 reasonably high meta share decks, with all of them being fairly good except for Dredge. And I guess you could do 9, so like 8 total decks. And then, like I said, Tinker, that's kind of an outlier here, where it did really poorly in the year, but the recent like Hexing Squelcher just changed things. So hopefully this Fantasticar restriction is just what Vintage needed. Hopefully this puts us back to where we were before. Where we were before was an amazing spot. WotC even said we were the epitome of format health, what they want for an eternal format. Hopefully this card restriction is enough to get us there. If not, you'll be seeing more of me in the future talking about things like maybe the One Ring, or Grim Monolith, or Tezzeret. I was actually really surprised by the range of answers that people gave into my last video talking about the possible choices for bans and restrictions. But I would assume that we'll end up with at least a slightly better metagame here, a slightly slower metagame, and hopefully that holds in a very meaningful way into Eternal Weekend. Notably, there is at least one card being printed tomorrow on Magic Online. The Hobbit has a Bilbo, which is kind of a tempo recursion Dreadhorde Arcanist blue creature. We'll see if that makes any splashes into Vintage. Definitely has some synergies with Luris and artifacts, so that'll be a pretty cool one to watch. Definitely one of my first few videos of the new format will contain a Bilbo, or 4, just to test it out and see how it goes. What do you think about this restriction? Are you mad that there's no text here? I kind of am. I'd like to see reasoning. I always like to see the reasoning they give. Let me know in the comments below, and hopefully we are now going to be back on schedule for more Vintage content every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I'll see you then.